When you went silent, she didn't feel abandoned at first, she felt confused. And that confusion is important because for a long time your presence had become predictable. She knew you would explain yourself, clarify misunderstandings, reassure her emotions, and smooth over discomfort. Even when things were tense, you were still there, emotionally available, filling in the gaps. Your attention acted like an emotional safety net. It softened consequences. It reduced uncertainty. It gave her a sense of control over how situations would land. But the moment that safety net disappeared, something shifted inside her. Your silence didn't scream anger or bitterness. It didn't demand a response. It simply removed a familiar emotional support she had unconsciously relied on. And that's what made it so powerful. For the first time, she had to sit with her own thoughts without your voice guiding the outcome. She had to feel the emotional weight without your reassurance cushioning it. That exposure is uncomfortable, and discomfort forces awareness. She expected you to react, to ask questions, to seek clarity, to chase closure. That expectation was built on history. You had trained her unintentionally to believe that no matter what happened, you would always be emotionally accessible. When that pattern broke, her nervous system noticed immediately. Silence creates a vacuum and the human mind hates empty space. In that space, reflection begins. She started replaying conversations, decisions, moments she once brushed past without consequence, not because you accused her, but because there was no longer anyone there to absorb the emotional aftermath for her. Your silence didn't punish her, it returned responsibility. That's the part she didn't expect. When you stop over-explaining and stop offering emotional rescue, the other person is left alone with the truth of how they showed up, and truth feels heavier when there's no one helping you carry it. She began to feel emotions she never had to fully experience before. Uncertainty, doubt, loss of control, and a subtle sense of regret she couldn't immediately name. What made it cut deeper was that your silence wasn't dramatic. You didn't block her to provoke fear. You didn't disappear to manipulate emotions. You simply withdrew your emotional availability. That quiet self-respect is unsettling to someone who is used to your consistency. It forces a realization. You are not just present. You are stabilizing her emotional world more than she understood. As days passed, the absence grew louder, not because of what you said, but because of what you no longer provided. She noticed the lack of validation, the missing reassurance, the emotional grounding you once offered. And in that absence, she started associating your presence with comfort, safety, and emotional regulation, things she had unconsciously outsourced to you. That realization changes feelings at a deep level because it reframes your value not as optional, but as foundational. Silence also removed her ability to test you. No reactions meant no feedback. No feedback meant no leverage. And without leverage, emotional dynamics reset. She could no longer predict you. And unpredictability, when paired with dignity, creates respect. Respect opens the door to emotional reevaluation. By stepping back, you allowed her to experience the consequences of life without your emotional support, not in a cruel way, but in a natural way. And natural consequences teach lessons. Words never can. That's why your silence didn't just create distance. It created depth. And sometimes the deepest emotional shifts begin the moment you stop saying anything at all. When you went silent, it didn't just change the dynamic, it disrupted the identity she had built around you. For a long time, she carried a specific version of you in her mind, the one who stayed steady, who showed up even when things were unclear, who remained emotionally accessible no matter how uncertain or inconsistent the situation became. That version of you felt permanent to her. It felt reliable. And because it felt reliable, it stopped being fully valued. She didn't expect that version of you to disappear. Not because she thought you were weak, but because she believed your attachment was unconditional. In her mind, you were the constant in the equation. Even when emotions fluctuated, even when distance appeared, she assumed your presence would remain intact. That assumption quietly shaped how she felt, how she acted, and how seriously she took the possibility of losing you. Your silence shattered that assumption. Without explanation, without confrontation, the dependable image she had relied on no longer matched reality. And that mismatch creates internal conflict. The mind struggles when what it believes no longer aligns with what it experiences. She found herself asking questions she never had to ask before, not about you, but about her own certainty. Why did this feel different? Why wasn't you reaching out? Why wasn't you reaching out? Why wasn't the familiar version of you restoring balance the way it always had? This is where the depth of change began. When the version of you she expected failed to show up, she was forced to confront the idea that she may have misunderstood your limits. She realized that your loyalty had boundaries, that your patience was a choice, not an obligation. And that realization can be destabilizing because it reframes the entire emotional history between you. She replayed moments you once dismissed, times when you showed restraint, when you held back instead of reacting, when you tolerated uncertainty without complaint. What once looked like emotional availability now revealed itself as emotional generosity. And generosity, once withdrawn, exposes how much was being given all along. The silence also removed the illusion of control. When she believed you would always remain emotionally reachable, she didn't have to consider the consequences of distance. But when that access vanished, the power dynamic shifted internally. She could no longer assume outcomes. She could no longer lean on predictability. And without predictability, attachment deepens not through comfort, but through awareness. What made this realization hit harder was that you didn't announce your departure from that role. You didn't demand recognition. You didn't ask to be seen differently. You simply stopped being the version of yourself she took for granted. That quiet withdrawal forced her to acknowledge something uncomfortable. The version of you she depended on was a privilege, not a guarantee. And when that truth settled in, her feelings changed. Not in a dramatic emotional outburst, but in a slow internal recalibration. She began to see you as someone with agency, boundaries, and self-respect, someone who could walk away from emotional imbalance without needing to prove a point. That perception creates gravity. It creates respect. And respect is what allows feelings to grow beyond surface attachment. In losing the version of you she assumed would always stay, she finally understood the value of the man she never expected to leave. When you chose silence, she didn't lose interest. She lost certainty. And that distinction matters. Certainty is what keeps emotions shallow. When someone knows exactly how you'll react, exactly what you'll say, and exactly where you'll stand no matter what, their emotional engagement stabilizes at a comfortable, controllable level. That's the state she was in before. She understood your patterns. She knew your triggers. She knew how to pull reassurance, clarity, or reaction from you whenever uncertainty appeared. Silence broke that system completely. She expected a response she could interpret. Anger she could justify, explanation she could debate, emotions she could manage. Even confrontation would have given her something solid to work with. Instead, she got nothing. No emotional signal, no feedback, no closure. And the absence of information is where curiosity is born. The human mind is wired to resolve unanswered questions. When there's no response, the mind fills in the gaps on its own. She began wondering what you were thinking, how you were feeling, whether you were hurt, detached, or simply done. Each unanswered question kept you present in her mind far longer than any argument ever could. Emotional curiosity doesn't fade quickly, it deepens because it has no endpoint. What made it even more intense was that she could no longer influence the outcome. When you react emotionally, the other person feels a sense of control. They can steer the conversation, soothe the tension, or escalate it depending on their comfort level. Your silence removed that leverage. She couldn't calm you down. She couldn't provoke you. She couldn't pull reassurance out of you. And without control, attention increases. She started revisiting past moments, not to defend herself, but to understand where things shifted. Silence forces introspection because there's no external narrative to push against. And in that introspection, she began to emotionally engage with you in a way she hadn't before. Internally, privately, without your involvement. That's where feelings start to change deeply because they're no longer reactive. They're self-generated. Curiosity also reactivated emotional investment. When things are predictable, emotions go on autopilot. When uncertainty enters, awareness sharpens. She noticed the absence of your energy, not just messages or words, but the emotional presence you once provided. And instead of feeling relief, she felt drawn inward, trying to understand why that absence affected her more than she expected. Your silence didn't chase her emotions, it invited them forward. Without pressure, without persuasion, without emotional pursuit, her feelings surfaced naturally. She began asking herself questions she never had to ask before. Do I miss him? Why does this feel unresolved? Why does the silence bother me more than his words ever did? Those questions create emotional depth because they bypass ego and go straight to feeling. What she didn't expect was that silence would make you feel larger, not smaller. When someone withdraws with dignity, their presence expands in the other person's mind. You became harder to define, harder to predict, harder to emotionally categorize, And mystery, when combined with past emotional connection, amplifies attraction at a subconscious level. Most importantly, your silence communicated self-control, not avoidance, not manipulation, but restraint, and restraint, and restraint signals confidence. It tells the other person that you don't need to explain yourself to be at peace, that you don't need to win emotionally to maintain self-worth. That quiet confidence reframed how she perceived you. She expected your emotions to orbit around her reactions. Instead, she felt her emotions orbit around your actions. Instead, she felt her emotions orbit around your absence. And that reversal from control to curiosity is what allowed her feelings to deepen without you saying a single word. When you chose silence, you didn't announce a shift in power, you embodied it. Power doesn't move through arguments or explanations, it moves through behavior. And the moment you stopped reacting the way you always had, the emotional balance quietly recalibrated. She may not have been able to name it at first, but she felt it immediately. Something was different, something had changed, and it wasn't coming from her, it was coming from you. Before, your reactions gave the dynamic its rhythm. When tension appeared, you responded. When distance appeared, you responded. When distance surfaced, you bridged it. When emotions rose, you engaged. That made the emotional flow predictable, and predictability creates perceived leverage. She knew where she stood because your responses confirmed it. Even disagreement reinforced connection because it still kept you emotionally invested. Silence removed that reinforcement. By not reacting, you stopped feeding the emotional loop. There was no argument to win, no reassurance to extract, no emotional signal to interpret. That absence broke the pattern that had quietly placed her in the position of emotional reference. And when that reference point disappears, the other person feels disoriented. Not threatened, but aware. This is where power shifts internally. Power isn't dominance, it's self-governance. By choosing not to react, you demonstrated that your emotional state was no longer dependent on her behavior. That's a profound signal. It communicates independence without hostility, strength without force, boundaries without words, and those signals are felt far more deeply than they are understood intellectually. She began to sense that she was no longer the emotional center of your world. That realization hits hard because it removes unconscious entitlement. When someone believes they can trigger your emotions at will, they feel secure. When that ability disappears, respect replaces comfort, and respect creates a different kind of emotional gravity, one rooted in awareness rather than assumption. Your silence also prevented escalation. There was no drama to anchor her emotionally, no conflict to resolve, no emotional exchange to regain balance. And without that, she was left alone with the shift. She couldn't negotiate it away, she couldn't reinterpret it through conversation, she had to feel it. And feeling is where deep emotional change occurs. What made this power shift undeniable was your consistency. Silence once can be dismissed. Silence maintained becomes a statement. It told her that you weren't reacting impulsively. You had made a decision. A decision to protect your peace. A decision to step out of emotional patterns that no longer served you. That kind of resolve changes how someone is perceived at a core level. She began to recognize that you were no longer seeking validation, approval, or emotional alignment. You were aligned with yourself. And self-alignment is magnetic because it signals inner stability. It tells the other person that your sense of worth isn't negotiable and that access to your emotional energy must be earned, not assumed. This shift also removed pressure. When you stop reacting, you stop pushing. And when pressure disappears, emotions surface more honestly. She wasn't responding to your words anymore. She was responding to your absence of need. And that absence of need reframed the entire connection. You didn't say you were done. You didn't declare independence. You simply acted in accordance with self-respect. And in doing so, you moved from being emotionally available on demand to emotionally grounded by choice. That's when she realized the power had shifted, not because you took it, but because you stopped giving it away. When you went silent, she may have initially interpreted it as distance, avoidance, or even emotional withdrawal. That's the surface level assumption many people make when they're used to constant access. But as time passed, that interpretation began to collapse. What replaced it was something far more unsettling and far more powerful. The realization that your silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. And restraint signals strength. Weakness reacts immediately. It explains itself. It rushes to be understood. Strength doesn't. Strength observes, decides, and acts in alignment with self-respect. Your silence carried that energy. You weren't disappearing out of fear or insecurity. You weren't punishing her to get a reaction. You were choosing not to participate in emotional patterns that drained you. That distinction matters, and she felt it even if she couldn't articulate it at first. What changed her perception was your consistency. If silence were avoidance, it would be temporary, shaky, or emotionally charged. But your silence was calm, stable, grounded. There was no passive aggression, no cryptic messages, no attempts to signal hurt. That emotional neutrality reframed everything. It forced her to reconsider who you really were beneath the role she'd assigned you. She began to understand that emotionally strong people don't need to announce their boundaries, they live them. And by living yours quietly, you communicated something profound. Your peace mattered more than being right, being chosen, or being validated. That realization carries weight because it exposes a level of maturity many people never develop. Your silence also reflected emotional self-trust. You trusted yourself enough not to chase clarity. You trusted your judgment enough not to beg for understanding. And you trusted life enough to let outcomes unfold without force. That kind of inner confidence is rare, and rarity amplifies value. When someone recognizes that you don't need their reaction to feel whole, it changes how they relate to you. She likely contrasted this version of you with past experiences, men who reacted impulsively, who tried to control outcomes through words, who sought reassurance through emotional displays. In that comparison, your silence stood apart. It felt composed, intentional, almost intimidating in its calmness. And that calmness triggered a new emotional awareness. You were no longer operating from attachment, but from choice. This is where respect enters. Not admiration, not attraction alone. Respect. Respect arises when someone demonstrates alignment with their values under pressure. And your silence showed that you are capable of stepping back without collapsing, withdrawing without resentment, and letting go without bitterness. That's not emotional withdrawal, that's emotional mastery. She began to see that you didn't need to convince her of your worth. You embodied it. And embodiment is far more persuasive than explanation. When you stop trying to be understood and start honoring your boundaries, people don't feel pushed, they feel recalibrated. Your silence didn't close the door emotionally, it raised the standard for access, and in doing so, it transformed how she felt, not because you demanded respect, but because you demonstrated it. That's when she realized your silence wasn't the absence of emotion, it was the presence of strength. When you stepped back and allowed silence to exist, you removed yourself from the emotional equation entirely, and that was the moment her feelings stopped being influenced by your presence and started revealing their true depth. Before, emotions were constantly shaped by interaction, by reassurance, by conversations, by tension, by repair. Even when things were uncertain, your involvement guided how she felt. Your words softened confusion. Your reactions gave her emotional direction. But silence removed direction. And without direction, emotions develop organically. That's what she didn't expect. She assumed that without your input, feelings would fade, stabilize, or resolve on their own. Instead, they intensified. Because when emotions are no longer being managed externally, they're forced to confront themselves. In the absence of your influence, she can no longer blame circumstance, miscommunication, or emotional momentum. There was no conversation to reinterpret, no argument to lean on, no reassurance to neutralize discomfort. What remained was raw feeling, uninterrupted, unfiltered, and unavoidable. That's where emotional truth lives. She started noticing emotional responses that surprised her. A sense of emptiness where your presence used to be. Moments of reflection she couldn't distract herself from. A lingering awareness of you that surfaced unexpectedly. In quiet moments, in familiar routines, in emotional pauses. And because you weren't there to reinforce or deny those feelings, they grew on their own terms. This is why silence creates depth instead of distance. When someone is present, emotions react. When someone is absent with dignity, emotions reveal. She wasn't responding to you anymore, she was responding to herself. And that internal response is far more powerful than anything triggered externally. Your absence also removed pressure. There was no expectation to respond, no urgency to decide, no emotional tug of war. Without pressure, feelings had room to breathe. And when feelings breathe, they either dissolve or deepen. In her case, they deepened because they were no longer fueled by drama, but by realization. She began to recognize the emotional role you had played in her life, not because you reminded her, but because it was suddenly missing. The way you grounded her, The way your presence provided emotional continuity, the way your consistency offered stability she didn't consciously acknowledge before. Those realizations don't surface during interaction, they surface in absence. What made this shift so profound was that it felt authentic. She couldn't accuse you of influencing her emotions. She couldn't tell herself she was reacting to pressure or persuasion. The feelings came from within, and when emotions arise internally, they carry weight. They feel real. They feel undeniable. Your silence also protected the integrity of that process. By not stepping in to explain, clarify, or reconnect prematurely, you allowed her emotional experience to unfold fully. No interruption, no emotional rescue, just space, and space is where awareness expands. Eventually, she understood that the depth of her feelings wasn't created by anything you said or did in silence. It was created by what your silence allowed her to finally see, that your value didn't depend on presence, that your impact didn't require persuasion, and that your absence wasn't empty, it was revealing. And that's why the change felt so deep to her, because for the first time, her feelings weren't shaped by you at all. They were shaped by the truth.